Alright, so this will be the Chapter 1 recap, and now I'm going to move ahead into some other things here. Skip over a lot of this stuff. But this slide, we'll get to what we're first at, but I'm going to cover this up first. I'm going to do these videos for each of the chapters as we go through this book, as long as we're doing this in this distance learning way. We'll hit some quick points. I'm not going to hit every single thing because you guys, I assume, are smart enough. You're reading this book. If you're reading the book, you're going to get moments like where Tom slaps Myrtle in Chapter 2. Nobody's missing that. So I'm not going to talk about that stuff as much. I'll brush over those things so that I can hit the points that maybe you don't hit as much. So to start off, we get to one of the most famous lines, and I'm going to read this straight out of the book. It is the advice that he gets from his father. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. I always enjoy this because we get this meme. Um, of course, everything's, well, meme, social media thing, whatever you want to call it. But you're not special for reading The Great Gatsby. We all went to high school, and someone threw that at the person as the first line of the book. And the person says, whoa, let's tone it down. I was just making a joke. So was I. It's the first line of the book. And the person had to admit they didn't actually read the book. So everyone's supposed to read Gatsby. But, you know how it goes. Hopefully all of you guys are reading it. You better be reading it. But anyway, from there, we get, of course, all these different characters, and some of the things that are key is we do get all this other stuff about, some of my slides here aren't going to make sense. I didn't fix these for these particular lectures, so you can ignore what's on the screen right now. But on page 2, we get some really good lines about Gatsby. I'm going to read this stuff to you. This is Nick talking about things here and says, only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Well, that's a big part, because the next line, Gatsby who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. So everything that Gatsby stands for, Nick hates. But Nick doesn't hate Gatsby. And we get the last line then, which is another one of the more famous lines from this book, one that uh, John Green likes to throw in a lot of his stuff, which, there are crash course videos that he does for this as well that we'll probably get to. So, no, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. And it's an interesting line, and it's something we'll revisit later. But it is what preyed on Gatsby, the foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams. This is definitely a book about dreams, and that's something that's worth keeping up. From there, we get just a lot of other little stuff about Nick. The one thing that I will mention, it does come up elsewhere, but the first reference to his college is that he went to college in New Haven. It later tells us that, of course, I graduated from New Haven in 1915. New Haven is not a university. He's a little coy about it, but a little later on, it says, I wrote a series of solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. He went to Yale, and so did Tom, and that's where they know each other. Yale was just as prestigious back then. It's basically right up there with Harvard, is obviously some of the most prestigious schools in America. So, yeah, Nick is of that class. He may not be as wealthy as Tom, but he's wealthy enough and attached enough, and not attached enough, connected enough is the word I actually mean to say there, to get into Yale. From there, of course, we get some other stuff about them, but I really want to jump then to when we meet Daisy, Tom, and Jordan. When we meet them, first of all, let's see. We get the initial references to Daisy, and the other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed, an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too, and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up to my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. And that's a great line to describe Daisy. Daisy is someone that can just be very, it can knock you sort of off your guard because she just is so able to draw you in. In fact, one of the very next lines, um, she hinted in a murmur, the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean towards her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. So she draws people towards her not just by being very likable and very attractive, but also the whole idea that even when she talks to you, she'll just talk kind of quiet, make you want to draw nearer to her because you can't even hear what she's saying. You want to be able to hear it because she is just so incredibly charming, is how she's kind of described here. And I do think that it's fun, especially if you kind of check out the two different versions of this film. There's many versions of this film in actuality, but the two that I know the best, one has Robert Redford as Gatsby. Um, if you know Redford from anything recently, he was the Alexander Pierce in Captain America: The Winter Soldier, the old guy that was kind of, I think he was the Secretary of Defense. That guy, and he's been in tons and tons of films, and is also a very famous director as well. But he was Gatsby in that one back in the 70s, and of course then there's the Leonardo DiCaprio one. The two different versions of these next lines: the whole town is desolate. This is the bottom of page 9. This is Nick saying this concerning whether they miss her in Chicago, and says there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. And in the 1970s version, she's very enthusiastic about this. She's like laughing. She's like, "Oh, how gorgeous! Let's go back." But in the new version, they actually play her as much more aloof, where like she doesn't fully buy into what Nick's saying. She's like, "How gorgeous," and then Nick has to give the rest of the explanation, because they actually move that line after "Do They Miss Me?" I think that's just a fun little way to kind of play Daisy off as a little bit more aloof and a little bit more disarming in a different way. Um, so then, of course, things continue, and this is when we start getting into the portion that I would call the exhibition of how Tom is just the absolute worst. And this list, of course, goes from chapter 1 and goes strong into chapter 2. But let's start off with the chapter 1 stuff. So we get the hulking thing, which is just a very funny spot to me. Said, "You did it, Tom." This is on 12. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a big, great big, hulking physical specimen." "I hate that word, hulking," objected Tom crossly, "even in kidding." "Hulking," insisted Daisy. And this is just a very passive aggressive little way for Daisy to just kind of like poke him, just stab him a little bit with this thing that she knows that he doesn't like. And it's just her way to sort of be obnoxious. She's got plenty of reasons to be obnoxious, many of which we're going to get to with, chapter 2 especially. But then we move on to the whole thing with the rise of the colored empires by this man Godard. This is just supposed to show that, again, not only is he a jerk in many other ways, but Tom is also wildly racist. This gets to the idea of eugenics, which eugenics is sort of the idea that you are limited and basically you are everything you are simply because of your genes, and that people of good breeding will have kids that are of good breeding. People of bad breeding will have will have kids of bad breeding. And we know, of course, that isn't true. Some of the most brilliant people are born out of nowhere. That's, they have parents that are very poor, but they, end up with a kid that is just absolutely brilliant. And there's lots of rich people that, have idiot kids as well. So that's not to say that rich people don't often have smart kids, and that poor people don't often have, kids that are of lower than average intellect. It's just that eugenics isn't as proven as people at this time thought. The other thing is that eugenics often kind of tied very much into the attitudes of Hitler with everything that happened with the atrocities in the Holocaust, and that kind of killed off the eugenics movement in America because, well, nobody wants to be associated with Hitler. But Tom here is associated with those eugenicist ideas with this book. We continue on, and of course, then we get the phone call in the middle of this. Dinner. Oh, actually, sorry, I skipped something. Before we get to the phone call, actually, it's even before any of this. So, actually, before dinner, this is back on page 11. This is something that I just missed. But there's the first mention of Gatsby. And again, Jordan and Nick are kind of talking, and brings up the fact that Nick is living in West Egg, and he says, "I don't know a single person." "Well, you must know Gatsby." And Daisy says, "Gatsby? What Gatsby?" And then dinner's served and basically moves things on. But that is foreshadowing, so just kind of keep that in mind. Now, moving into more of why Tom is the worst, then we get, of course, the phone call, and that is Myrtle Wilson. We don't know her name yet, but it is, of course, his mistress. and she's calling in the middle of dinner. Daisy gives it a moment, but then does follow back in just to kind of interrupt things and to make Tom feel uncomfortable. And they listen, that is, Jordan and Nick listen as they fight. And when Daisy comes back out, Daisy and Nick kind of go for a walk outside, and that's when she talks about when she had her daughter. And as it says, the top of 17, I was talking about the nurse. She told me it was a girl, so I turned my head away and wept. That gives you the real feelings on this. All right, I said, I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. That definitely shows you something about the real relationship between these two. Daisy, it's, at least at this point, pretty completely miserable in this marriage. From there, there's some other things, but the last point that I really want to hit then is, of course, when they go back, when Nick goes back to his house, and he sees, of course, a man outside Gatsby's house, kind of looking out over the water. He sees a faint green light in the distance, and eventually, like he looks back at where the person was, presumably Gatsby, and Gatsby's gone. That green light is going to be a very important thing. So with that, let's move to chapter 2. I'm going to stop this video and we'll start the last one. We'll hit that one real quick.